as this says, I want to kind of talk about ways to think about your more able kids. And I like things in tens, as you'll see. The idea of 10 ways to think about your more able kids. We're going to be looking at some of the research that sits behind it. So 10 researchers and their perspectives. Then we're going to be looking at 10 ways to think about more independent learning and curiosity. I'm going to put the two keynotes into one. So although on your agenda it has keynote 1, keynote 2, there's no point in kind of stopping and saying, and now I'm going to be talking about high expectations, because it's all part of the same thing. I want to kind of kick off with just a little bit about who we are. I set up London Gifted and Talented in 2004. And the aim behind it very much was to look at how we, as part of London Challenge, could support our most disadvantaged schools and most disadvantaged boroughs. And as always with anything to do with education, there's a euphemism involved in it. We called them keys to success schools and keys to success boroughs. And you know very well in education, if you've been in it for any length of time, I taught for 20 years in inner city schools. As soon as there's a euphemism involved, it means something's going wrong in the system. And the keys to success schools were the ones where no one wanted to teach. There was a huge flight of middle-class parents going away from those kind of schools and from those boroughs as well. And it wouldn't come as any surprise to you to know that they were boroughs like Haringey, which seems to get a huge amount of press, and a few others around London that were struggling. And the aim behind what we did was to go in and work with schools to point out to them that they needed to be thinking about their most able kids. And to start with, in 2004, 2005, it was an uphill struggle, because we had loads of teachers, loads of head teachers indeed, turning around to us and saying things like, well, we don't have any bright kids. Really? No, we don't get bright kids, because we just get all our kids from that estate. Now, I find that for 1,001 reasons enormously offensive. One, because I was one of those kids from one of those estates. Two, because the idea that you just happen to be born in a poor background means you can't be clever. And so, to start with, it was a kind of hearts and minds battle that we had on our hands. Within about a year, things turned around, and I think, as you probably know, there's been quite a lot of publicity about how successful London Challenge was. And London is still the only capital city in the world whose averages for AA star, for A to C, etc., is above the national average, substantially above the national average. And given the fact that in London, half the children, just over half the children, have English as a second language. So you're looking at some fairly interesting issues around EAL, and you're looking at some fairly interesting issues around refugees and immigration. And we're looking at schools that have adapted and applied their best ideas, their best thinking into this. Now, one of the things that Tim Brighouse, who ran London Challenge, always used to say, he always used the term small fires in the darkness, and I thought it was beautiful. He said basically small fires in the darkness was the only way that we as individual schools, as individual teachers, could make any difference. We couldn't change the entire system, but you could light a small fire in the darkness. And he recognized that some of the best, most interesting practice that was going on across London was not happening by any means in the best schools. In fact, almost the reverse. What we were finding was that some of the best schools had some of the most complacent practice. They didn't need to be that great because the kids they had in front of them had been selected to within an inch of their life. So the fact that they were coming out top of the league tables was no surprise to anyone. One head teacher that I work with, highly selective school, 3,000 applications, 90 places, said we could lock our kids in a cupboard for 5 years and they'd still come up with 10 A stars. And so effectively what Tim did was say, you know what, we need to focus on some of the more disadvantaged schools and locate where the interesting practice was happening. Because actually what was happening there was quite transformative. There were schools that had amazingly good practice when they were dealing with, for example, EAL kids from Somalia or from Turkey. We went in, we found that practice, and we expanded on that practice. So, for example, we ran a whole load of workshops for EAL Turkish speakers, because Turkish boys were doing incredibly badly across London. And we realized why, because one of the issues was that if you live in certain parts of Islington and Haringey, you don't actually, and you're Turkish, you don't need to speak in English at all. Your whole life can be conducted in Turkish. The only time you are required to speak English would be if you went into school. So what we did was we set up a series of workshops with the parents and the boys, if we could, the fathers. It didn't matter in the end, it was fathers and mothers, but the kind of key element was we ran GCSE workshops for both fathers, mothers and child. So we ran them together after school. So that what was happening at the end of, say, a 2-year course was that we had parents who were struggling along with their kids to learn English, but also successfully doing it. And we had some astonishing success stories in terms of enhancing their career opportunities as well. And that's kind of like a small example of the kinds of things that were going on. Now imagine that across an entire city. London basically educates about 1/5 of the population. So it's quite a kind of substantial network of practices that were going on. As you can see from there, we worked with about 3,000 schools. And what's the end result of that has been that I've been enormously privileged to be able to go into a huge number of schools, a huge number of classrooms, and kind of locate what I think is interesting practice. And you may have noticed I keep using the word interesting rather than best or outstanding. Simple reason, any teacher that I know who's pretty good would prefer to pluck out their own eyes than say that what they did was outstanding. It just isn't part of what we do. We don't talk about ourselves as outstanding. But if you use the word interesting, then teachers are far more likely to share what they do. Because interesting can also mean, I tried it, it died on its arse. That's fine. Because actually those are the moments when you learn a huge amount and you change that practice as a result. Or it died on its arse in that class, but actually it was really successful over here. And so that idea of sharing of interesting practice, I think, is far more useful. Now, we've also now started working last 5 or 6 years with initiatives across Singapore, New York, Hong Kong. And when I was speaking to the council a bit earlier on, I just said, the stuff that's coming along now here is world class. And I know it's world class because I've seen what goes on in other areas. So we need to be looking at how we can build on what we've got. So I want to kind of kick off with showing you a bit about the website. Now, that's what it looks like, and that's the web address. So it's mattwales.org. Not so tricky. And I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it, but I will show what I think it looks like. Sorry, I'm going to have to stick this buzzy thing in again now. So this is it. As you can see, it's a kind of partnership deal. I quite deliberately wrote stuff at the start to bring in Estyn, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Wales, because I think we do need to be looking at how we're going to be judged. I do not think, as teachers, we should be putting our biggest efforts into impressing inspectors, but I do think it's sensible to know what they're going to be judging us on. And as you can see, as you go through, there's stuff around in the classroom, looking at the kind of depth and breadth, stuff around identification of able underachievers, stuff around thinking skills, differentiation, questioning, provision, etc., etc. There's a lot going on there. So If, for example, we wanted to go into questioning techniques, click on, and then quite deliberately restricted the number of articles that are here to about 5 or 6, because frankly, you're probably not going to read more than that. But if there's something that might interest you in here, you can go into a launchpad on questioning skills, stuff around Bloom's taxonomy if you're interested, stuff around keywords for questioning, Key Stage 3 training, and these are just straightforward downloadable resources that you can use. In addition, if you go back onto homepage, all along here, you've got the training one's probably an interesting one to have a look at. So what we've tried to do here is to set up some resources that you can use if you are training people in your schools. So I'll give you an example. This is thinking skills. So there's a flash film. It's deliberately done with kind of not quite stick figures, but not anything, because it's quite anonymous. Doesn't matter what environment you're in, you're not going to be a purple teacher teaching yellow kids. But it does matter in places, certainly in London, where 90 to 95% of the population may well be Bengali, that you don't have just white faces peering back at you. So in this one, we just have this is on thinking skills.
This section gives an overview of thinking skills, on the different types of thinking that exist, and how you can foster thinking within the classroom. So what does thinking mean?
Okay. There's deliberate pauses all the way through. As you can see here, it basically works on a fast-forward scenario. So it gives you, as a teacher, time then to stop, talk to your colleagues about it, or if you know your colleagues have already got up to a certain point, you can just skip forward.
There are 2 teaching thinking.
And each time you do it, it gets slightly trickier.
1. Make sure the climate is appropriate for students to think in. 2. Immerse students into the language of thinking. 3. Set a good pace for delivery of lessons. 4. Make thinking an active process. 5. Try to develop a community of thinkers. And finally, 6. Always build in time for reflection. In the classroom, the teacher should be on hand to ask challenging and probing questions that invite appropriate reasoned judgment, and should always reward thinking when evaluating a student's work.
Again, pause time, chance to kind of reflect, to talk about what we do in a classroom, whether we believe that those 6 ingredients are that useful. I'm a great believer in all of this stuff, that we don't ever talk about this is the way. If you noticed in your packs, we talk about ways to think about intellectual curiosity, or ways to think about differentiation. Deliberately leaving it open to us as professionals to disagree. To actually say, yes, okay, I think of those, I can use 5 or 6, but the other half, no, not so much. I think it's key that we talk about how we can explore certain issues. So I think the next one, so that was 6 ingredients.
Take some time to consider what's going on in your class. When do you involve students in classifying and sorting ideas and concepts in order to make patterns and connections? How do you encourage students to organize their memory skills and their thoughts? How often do you use mind mapping, signs, symbols, and information grouping with these students? How do you encourage your students to develop their thinking skills? How do you involve your students in decision making, where they're required to define the situation and state the goal, generate ideas, and so forth? When do you give students opportunities to compare and contrast situations and alternatives so they can develop logical and analytical thinking skills? What are you doing to raise students' awareness of how they think? If you're not doing any of these at the moment, how will you start?
Always leaving options for schools that are just kicking this off. Now, I won't go into any more detail than that, but as you can see, it's a kind of staged scenario. So we went into thinking skills here under training. You've also got stuff around differentiation. There is a PowerPoint that matches the flash film. So you can download the PowerPoint and use that as your kind of security blanket if you're doing your own training, or simply as a kind of bit of a notes thing for you as you're doing it. The aim is very much to try and share. I'm trying to think of the key message here. I think the key message that I'm trying to get to here, God, that's annoying. Key message I'm trying to get to here is that when we do stuff like this, and when we train one another and we kind of work on what I think is useful, the most important thing that we found worked across London was to get your more able kids and the training for your more able kids and the work for your teachers absolutely allied to what your school wants to do anyway. It's vitally important. So, for example, your school may well be doing a push on thinking skills, or it may well be doing a push on independent learning. We have got way too passive a kind of workforce in terms of the kids, and therefore we as teachers are working 5 times harder than we ought to be, and they're having quite a nice time of it, you know. And if that characterizes your school, then something around independent learning needs to happen. It's very easy then to ally work around your more able with that independent learning focus. So it's not seen by your colleagues as additionality. It's not seen as, oh God, yet another thing to do. It's seen as, okay, we're making a big push around independent learning. That's for our benefit as teachers. Hopefully it will mean that our kids are a bit more active. We don't have to work as hard, and we're kind of moving this initiative forward. And everything that we're doing in terms of our more able fits in and dovetails with that rather well. So it's simply a means by which you can look at more able, and there needs to be a kind of set of different, why has that done that? A set of different ways and focuses. Okay, so that's the website. We will be running some webinars as we mentioned earlier on, and I think it's critically important that it's up to you to decide what you need from this. So whichever focus that we go through today, and there are a lot of them, that you think is worthwhile following up in terms of a particular initiative, it's an angle you want to take, then feel free to contact either Nicola or Alistair to say, this is what we quite like. And then the webinar can be set up following that on. Or it can simply be, we'd like to know a little bit more about level 6, or we'd like to know a little bit more about A or A star. It's absolutely up to you to decide how you best want to do it. Okay, now that's, play around with it, have a look at it. If there are any issues that you've got, please let us know straight away. It's the first kind of kick-off point. It's taken quite a few weeks to get it in the kind of format it's in and to kind of work on it, but it's very flexible. It's written in WordPress, so you can change it. All of the stuff that's, that you've got here as physical handouts will be uploaded onto the website as well, so you've got those handy. And I think that's quite useful as well, so you can download them and use them as you need to. The next thing that I wanted to focus on, in 2 secs, was this one. Now, this is going to seem particularly odd, I would imagine, to most people in this room. There was a network called the Rural G&T Network. G&T was the more able scenario for UK, for England. And they spent a lot of time trying to work out what they wanted to do with this, and they weren't coming up with very much. And quite bizarrely, they asked if I could write something for them. So London, I'm born in London, I've lived in London all my life, and I've kind of very rarely gone outside London apart from other cities usually. So I've written this, which is quite odd, but it's all around rurality. Now, I didn't do it on my own. What I did do was I managed to get about 7 or 8 colleagues of mine from around, all around the UK, in fact. And so we've got work here from the Shetlands, we've got work here from rural areas in Kent and in Cumbria, coastal areas. And the key thing is trying to define What is significant or different about a rural context for your more able kids? Why should it have any impact whatsoever? What's the additional dimension that rurality offers into this? And the first one is just simply a kind of, okay, so what is it we mean by rural? And within it, what are those kind of challenges? So what are the patterns of achievement? What are the challenges that this offers schools? But more significantly, what's this rural context got to do with anything? And on this inside sheet here, on the right-hand side, we're looking at factors. How is it different, for example, in terms of transport? Why should transport have a particular impact on more able kids? One of the things that came very clear from an awful lot of places that we talked to was that a lot of extension classes and enrichment classes will run after school. Some of the kids accessed it, but they weren't necessarily the most able kids. They just happened to be the kids who lived quite near the school, because the other lot had got a coach that took them away at the end of school. And there was nothing that seemingly that could be done about that. You know, the coach left at 3:50, those kids were gone. The other thing that was noted was that kids from very much rural farming communities often didn't take any involvement in this kind of enrichment activity either, because they had a whole load of other stuff that they needed to be doing on the farm, and that took them away. So it's things like that, poorer career opportunities, lower aspirations. That sounds harsh, and it sounds like it's a criticism. It's not. It's simply looking at the fact that sometimes, the range of jobs, for example, that are out there for some rural kids seem to be much more restricted. There's a fantastic French film that I'll kind of dig out for you in a few minutes if I can, before we finish off, called Être et Avoir. And it's all about this little French school where they have every single year is in one class. They're tiny little communities, and essentially it follows the life of one of those teachers who, if you don't fall in love with 20 minutes into the film, you have no heart. Just a wonderful man who's completely committed himself to this particular community. And one of these things he says, what do you want to be, when he asks his kids this stuff? And they come up with, they want to be, let me think, oh yes, a farmer. Or they want to be a hot air balloonist, because that was the only way they could see of escaping that community, I guess. There was other ones who just said, oh, I want to be a teacher. But effectively, that was it. That was the kind of limited range of options that these kids were looking at. And it's kind of almost heartbreaking, because these kids were 6 years old, and already the kind of parameters had moved in so greatly. I'll dig it out, because it's worth a look just to kind of see it. So there's something there around, it's not a, it's a way of looking at it. And I was talking to Alistair in the car this morning on the way in. There were some communities that I went into, so I know it absolutely from first hand, where the last thing they wanted to do, this is in Cumbria particularly, the last thing they wanted to do was have their more able kids recognised as more able. Because if they did that, there was a very good chance that that kid would do quite well for themselves and leave. And this particular community in Cumbria didn't even want their kids to go to the local university. They didn't even want them. Lancaster was too far. And they knew very well that if that kid had got the kind of launch pad to go to Lancaster, they'd head off wherever it might be. And so it was almost a community looking in on itself to see how it could protect itself from the outside. And one of the ways of protecting itself effectively, I think the phrase I used that was cut from this, was they were kneecapping their own kids. Unsurprisingly, that got cut by the editorial committee, but it's almost what they were doing. There was an element of, hang on, wait a minute, really? You've got kids that you think don't deserve to live in the bigger world. And of course, you could look at it from their perspective, and they were seeing that it's I know this is quite controversial, but they were looking at it from a very particular perspective, and you need to do that. So this doesn't offer any judgments within it, but what it does do is say, okay, well, if that's the case, what are we going to do about it? What can we do that supports it? The second one is looking around issues of identification. And this one's quite useful for this inside bit here. The way you identify, obviously, is up to you. It's your own local context. It's what you want to do. But this thing here, how many people have seen me before? Just kind of quick hands up. Okay. We're going over old ground here. I apologize. But there's a thing called the institutional quality standards that quite a few of us spent quite a long time working on. And effectively, it was a means of taking a snapshot of your school to say, what are you doing well? And it was quite a simple one that just had entry level, developing level, or exemplary level. And it took identification, it took provision, it took community, whatever it may have been, these different kind of characteristics, and said, okay, what does that look like if it's entry level? What does that look like if it's exemplary? So what we did was we took these institutional quality standards and applied it to a rural context. And said, okay, if we think that an entry level is that you are identifying your kids and there's an agreed definition and a shared understanding of what you're looking at, a developing level looks at that you do that and then you screen it annually, and an exemplary level looks at you using multiple sources of information. Now, if that's what we believe to be the case, what are the kind of questions that we need to ask in terms of rurality? Question number one, do we know who our rural learners are? In some schools, it's pretty easy, every kid in the class. But for some schools, it isn't that simple. And you've got some kids who are far more rural than others. Are rural learners proportionately represented on your more able lists? This one throws up some really interesting questions in its own right, obviously. You could ask, should they be? You could say, isn't it social engineering to try and make sure that we've got all of our most rural kids proportionally represented on the register? My belief is that you need to be asking yourself these questions. Because at least then, if someone comes in and says, how do you know that you have a representative register, at least you've thought it through and thought about what the issues might be. You've at least explored it. In London, I remember when I was doing the running a kind of school scenario, we had 148 languages in the school. And we had something like 95, 96 different refugee groups in that school. So my nightmare was trying to make sure that all of those kids were included as well. Did we have enough Somali kids, for example, on the register? And I managed to get, at one point in my career, I did manage to get a fully representative register, I thought. We had, we'd broken it down on pretty much every level we could think about. Free school meals, English as an additional language. We did parental education, so whether they'd gone on to university or not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we had a category at the end, which was refugee. And it was all looking great. And then someone said to me, okay, when you look at your refugee figure, where are these refugees from? And I'm kind of, oh, for God's sake, really? And it's interesting, what we found was that almost every single one of the group kids in the refugee group that were considered to be more able, gifted and talented were from Eastern Europe. We had loads of kids coming in from former Yugoslavia. We'd had loads of kids coming in from Bulgaria, and those were the kids, unsurprisingly, because they were already fluent in at least 2 languages. They were normally taught Russian and their own home language to start with, and they were learning English as a third language. Unsurprisingly, some of these kids were pretty smart. So as a result, our register was skewed. It was skewed away from North Africa, where we had loads of kids coming in, Moroccan kids that just weren't appearing on the register at all. I'm not suggesting that you need to go that way, because frankly, that way madness lies. But you do need to be asking yourself the questions. and you need to be exploring it. And that's all that this document is trying to do. It's trying to say to you, okay, if you agree with these characteristics in terms of whether you think this is positive, what are your questions? What are the questions you're asking yourself? And we do, and the rest of it, I won't go through this in ad nauseum. We then do a thing around provision. Again, looking at, in this case, effective provision as the IQS. Possibly the most important one of all, the fourth one, engaging parents and communities. And in this one, the IQS is quite clear. So entry-level IQS, if you look at this is number 4, if you look at entry-level IQS, parents and carers are aware of the school's policy, contribute to its identification processes, and are kept informed of developments in G&T provision through annual school information profiles. That's entry-level. How many schools think they're there on that one? How many schools would say, yeah, absolutely, that's what we're already doing? That's what I thought. So it really is now trying to look at, what are you doing? The IQS has about 16 different elements. If you were to look at all 16 elements and look at it in terms of what you're doing, again, that way madness lies. What I would highly recommend is that you look at the IQS and you select maybe 3 or 4 key elements that you think are most important. I would suggest you look at identification. I would suggest you look at provision. And if you're doing something particularly well, I would say that would be the third one to look at. You need to be thinking to yourself, what's manageable? What can I deal with? And possibly, if engaging with parents and communities might be one that you want to go for, and you don't think you're doing that well, this might be quite a useful little look at what that might look like. So, the active engagement for parents, if you look at, on this page here, on this inside third page, the third one down, to enable parents and carers to support and challenge their child. Okay? The question is, what could this look like? It could look like finding out what the learning needs of that kid are, developing communication, sharing parents and carers' understanding of the child within the school, equipping them to challenge the school where appropriate, supporting extending learning beyond the classroom. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. What potential challenges might you have to address? And these are the interesting ones. Parents or carers' own fear of their capacity to support their child. It's a huge issue. It's one of those issues that is hardly ever talked about. But if you come from a more disadvantaged background, it is sometimes highly unlikely that your parents will be able to support you beyond a certain point. And my own personal history on this one, both my parents left school when they were 11. I got effectively told when I was about 9, that's it. You know, in terms of any support, forget it from here on in. They supported me in terms of what I wanted to do. They knew they couldn't support me in terms of what that might look like. So it's that. It's kind of, it's the second one, poor levels of family, especially, and all the research says this, especially maternal literacy. Mum's educational background is hugely significant. All the reports and all the research suggest that. So what is it you can do to support the mum in this process? And some of that is reassurance. Some of that is simply saying, you know what, your kid, just because they're more able, doesn't mean they've suddenly grown a second head. It kind of means you need to do what you're doing already and keep supporting emotionally. Because your kid isn't a brain on legs. Your kid is actually exactly the same as your kid was earlier on when you didn't know that. But the key thing is the emotional support is still necessary. It still needs to be there. And then I think the addressing of the parents or the carers' negative experiences of education. Again, highly common, highly likely. I've worked with a huge number of parents who were quite literally shaking when they came into school. And having to kind of put an arm around and walk them in and kind of like reassure them that this wasn't going to be a place where either they or their children were going to be eaten alive. Because that was the level of fear that those parents had. So it's a wide package we're looking at, and I think the key message when you were talking earlier on, Nicola, about the inclusive agenda, we need to make sure that all of this isn't looking at it in terms of these kids being kind of somehow particularly different, but we are looking at, are we meeting these kids' needs? And those needs may be many and various, and some of those needs are to do with a disadvantage agenda. Okay, final one is just looking at leadership. Effectively, if we've said all of this needs to happen, what we've done here is just kind of summarized what we think good leadership might look like in terms of this. It's just something to bounce off. It's just something that you might want to have a look at, read through. It might stimulate your thinking. The key element to all of this is I cannot know your context. You're the only person who can know that. You're the only person who knows your parents. You're the only person who knows the kids involved in your school. But this might actually kick off some interesting thinking. That was the aim behind it anyway. Okay. Now, I just wanted to kind of go through some research perspectives. This is looking at your more able kids. This is a researcher that a lot of people have probably already read, a guy called Guy Claxton, and it's around a thing called building learning power. An issue that has to be faced is that learning capacity is as much a matter of character as it is of skill. Being able to stay calm, focused, and engaged when you don't know what to do is not a matter of technical training. It requires self-concept that's not been infected by the pernicious idea that being confused and making mistakes means you're stupid. There's a whole lot that sits behind this quote that you need to unpack, you need to look at. The danger of highlighting certain kids as being more able than other kids sort of suggests that there is a fixed mindset. And sometimes kids can absorb that. The idea somehow that they've got to be clever in all things. And of course they're not. Also that they should expect to get stuff right all the time. And of course they won't. In fact, that's the worst case scenario. I always look at schools in terms of their books, and if you start to see all of the beautifully neat double underlined work with 10 out of 10 pretty much across the board, what you've got is a very easily pleased parent community. Oh wow, look at this, my kid's doing all this, isn't it great? And a very bored child, because they're not being stretched. The idea that any kid's getting top marks all the time, those are the kids that are not being stretched. We are failing those kids. So it's very much trying to address this issue that it's hugely important to get stuff wrong. And for making a mistake, not to mean, oh my God, that must mean I'm thick, but to see the making a mistake as absolutely part of the learning process, an essential part of the learning process. Any thoughts on anything I've said so far?
I think nowadays children, they seem to lack resilience, and I think that it's, and I often wonder why. You know, I agree with you. I think getting it wrong needs to be seen as an opportunity for new learning to take place. But I think that it's almost as if they're very fearful and they're very over-anxious about not getting it right.
Yep.
And it's something I've noticed in the last 6 or 7 years especially. And
what are your thoughts on it? Why do you think that might be happening?
I think perhaps, I think it may be tied into their own self-perception, how they perceive themselves, and how that has been constructed and reinforced by us or by their parents.
Right.
If they've grown up within a climate where perhaps they're encouraged to take more risks.
it's unusual to take more risks. And if you come from a certain community background, and within certain schools I can walk in, unless kids see teachers taking real risks, where are they going to learn where to take risks? Said before on another occasion that whenever I was in school, I used to teach English, psychology and politics, a bit of film studies and a couple of other bits and bobs, economics. The stuff I never used to go into any lessons that I used to teach. Where I saw interesting lessons happening in schools, obviously I was a secondary teacher, was PE, drama, music. That's where risks were being taken in the school that I taught at. So those are the lessons I used to go in and watch like a hawk, because actually they were dealing with some, it was an inner city comp that I taught at, some incredibly challenging kids who literally would be bouncing off the ceiling in my lesson, were the most immaculately poised and wonderful learners in drama and PE. So something I was doing was kind of causing all of this bouncing to happen, and something they were doing was absolutely working much better than anything I could do. So it's that kind of learning process, and often it was because the teachers were taking far more risks. I used to, for example, spend an awful lot of time trying to get my kids to move into groups, and the resistance was huge. No, I want to sit with my friend. And yet in drama lessons, they walked in, and the drama teacher would go, okay, you there, you there, you there, you over there, you over there. Okay, it's now mixed groups. You're doing that for 4 minutes. 3 minutes later, after that, you'll be doing this, and then 2 minutes after that, you'll be doing this. I would never in a million years think that I could get away with that. But because this teacher, that was part of their regular way of dealing with these kids got used to that's what they did. And that's risk-taking to me. That's huge risk-taking, because you're saying, I'm completely in control of this lesson.
Where do you see, I think it's interesting because, what about the staff, the management, within the school then? Because actually, if you've got a staff, there's a certain sense of responsibility, isn't there, on the culture within, the school itself. So if your management team are sort of pushing teachers to take those risks, then, that culture is out there, so there's another dimension to this.
Absolutely. How many people here are part of the management team in their school? Quite a lot. Okay. I'm a huge believer that 10-minute observations are very, very powerful. And I say 10-minute observations very deliberately because no one has the time to spend an hour watching someone else teach. And actually, pretty much, you can gain what you need in 10 minutes. If I'm going in and I'm watching you, for example, and I know, because we've talked about it, that you feel quite comfortable around questioning. Yeah, it's something that, it's one of your strengths. You feel a lot less comfortable around assessment, but that's actually one of my strengths. I watch you for 10 minutes. I feed back everything that I've seen, and I mean everything. I've never come away from an observation with less than 2 pages of A4 notes, even on 10 minutes, because there's so much going on within that. And I think it's our professional duty to let our colleagues know exactly what we saw. No judgment involved in it, there really isn't. And the danger is that observation has now become hugely tainted with judgment, because we're being judged by Estin or Ofsted, we're being judged by performance management, all this kind of stuff. But actually, this is about professional support and development. And if you can get that process underway, so for example, I come in, I watch you 10 minutes, I feed back everything that I saw, and it's just between you and I. It doesn't go anywhere else, but I give you everything that I saw. We have a discussion then about what good questioning looks like. You feel pretty good, because actually you know you're doing this pretty well. You come in and you watch me with assessment, I feel pretty good because I know I do that stuff pretty well. But there's some stuff that you can point out to me on assessment that I didn't know I did. You can make my practice much more explicit. You can tell me, you can ask me a question, why did you do that? I may never have thought about it as a teacher. I may never once have kind of gone, oh, I did that because this, or that kid, or that moment, or that, But by pointing out to me what I'm doing, you're making me much more explicit in terms of. the next stage on in terms of management, I think, and it's a good question from Nicola there, the next stage on in terms of management is to say, okay, well, now you and I have had a good conversation about what I think good questioning looks like in your lessons and what you think good assessment looks like. We could just jot down, in our school, we think good questioning may well start off like this. It may well be about 3 or 4 big concept questions at the start of a lesson that are around the classroom. It may be that we kick off with the most difficult questions first, because that's quite an interesting strategy, and it works because I've seen it work in your lessons. You may point out to me in terms of assessment, we think that actually really good assessment is when, as kids walk out the door, they put a sticky note on either side of the door. On this side of the door, the stuff they feel secure about, and on this side of the door, the stuff they still have questions about. That might be a technique that's working for me, but the key thing is it's working for us because it's working in our school. We put a few notes down and say, okay, this is what we think works within our school. That goes out to the rest of the staff, they have a good laugh, and then they kind of say, well, actually, no, that might be that's worth trying. That might be really interesting. I might have a go at that. Because the key thing is, it doesn't matter what I say, and I really mean that. It really doesn't matter what I say. Because you automatically know that I'm from London, and I don't know your context. But they will listen to you, because you're in that context. So if it works for you in your school, other teachers are going to be interested. They're going to know that it's not some theoretical bull, that it's actually something that's working. So I think that would be what I would say, to kind of get the management context so that teachers are more involved in sharing what they do. They're less worried about the kind of observational scenarios, and they see themselves then as part of the continuing professional development. So you kind of working on something, you're talking with colleagues about something in depth, you're giving lots of feedback, and it could well be, and I've seen this happening in a few schools, it's quite risky for the teacher concerned, but it's the next stage on, which is if you felt pretty secure having me in for 10 minutes and you come away from that experience thinking, well, you know, I'm all right on this, you then have all of the table in. And they're all along the back and they're watching you do something for 10 minutes. And again, doing the same kind of feedback. And I've seen schools transforming themselves doing that. You have to have a safety culture within there. And I mean, it's kind of odd. You need to feel safe to take risks. And that's key. And I think that matters within a management structure. And that taking risks needs to come from the top as well. You need to see that in action. And of course, head teachers and deputy head teachers, if they're teaching, should be part of this professional development, them being observed too. Okay? Any other thoughts or questions so far? Okay. This one, again, Guy Claxton. And he's talking about children being designed to be apprentices. That they apprentice themselves to anyone they like. Keyword there. Who is doing something interesting. Even watching you struggle a bit is good learning. Teachers and parents are not omniscient or omnipotent. It helps children grow if they can be privy to some of their elders' uncertainties. Not when they're falling apart, but when they're floundering just a little. Again, spoken about it before, I think it's hugely significant for teachers to talk about their own learning histories. And it's something you see so rarely. And I mean learning histories. They are under the notion that you were born a teacher, you were born with the expertise you've got, you didn't really have to struggle for it, it's just pretty much at your fingertips. And it does an awful lot of good for kids to know actually that you struggled. There were certain concepts, there were certain ideas that you found difficult, that you found tricky. Ideally, to see that you actually got through it in the end and you were okay with it. But that kind of Again, it gets back to the issue we were talking about earlier on about mistakes. You know what? I've made loads of mistakes. I've got loads of stuff wrong. I couldn't do that. I had to try this, it didn't work so well. I tried that, it also didn't work so well. Finally, I tried that and it worked better for me. That kind of conversation, I think, is hugely important for your more able kids. It's hugely important for all kids. With all of this, the point I'm making with everything here is that if it is good for your more able kids, I think the kind of things that we've been talking about are good for all of your students. This one, some of you will have seen it before. It's the famous Claxton 4 R's. Nothing in education unless it's got alliteration. So alliteration here of resilience, resourcefulness, reciprocity and reflection. They're quite useful. They're part of a book that he wrote called Building Learning Power. He's one of the more interesting researchers. He used to be a practitioner. He does know a little bit about classrooms. He's kind of watched an awful lot and he's observed and he's come up with some quite interesting things. And the other major benefit of reading any of his work is that it's all quite short. The other point I wanted to make on this one, the reason I put this into this format was that teachers are a lot less intimidated being given something like that to look at than a chapter or an article. This has a kind of clarity about it. The effort effect. This one, I think, fantastic phrase. If parents want to give their children a gift, the best thing they can do is teach their children to love challenge, be intrigued by mistakes, enjoy effort, keep on learning. That way, their children don't have to be slaves of praise. They will have a lifelong way to build and repair their own confidence. I imagine every single one of us in this room has had our confidence in ourselves as learners at times ripped to shreds. If you haven't, well done. But if but I think it's a norm. Now we, presumably, have got some of the resilience that you were talking about that some of the kids now seem to have less of. And I think the question that you asked is hugely important. Why? What's changed? Because I think my generation, 50 plus, comes from a certain kind of perspective. And I think we did have a huge amount of resilience. I suspect, looking at it, that the generation below mine and below that still had quite a lot of resilience. It seems to be this generation. It seems to be the generation going through schools at the moment that seems to be almost more fragile in terms of it. And I don't know, I suspect it may have, it's a whole wider question that we can go into, but I suspect the way we parent may well have something to do with it. I certainly think, that tough love idea that my mum seemed to be so keen on worked. Okay, now this one again, I think, is worth having a think about. It's Carol Dweck. After 7 experiments with hundreds of children, we had some of the clearest findings I've ever seen. Praising children's intelligence harms their motivation, and it harms their performance. How can that be? Don't children love to be praised? Yes, they love praise. They especially love to be praised for their intelligence and talent. It gives them a boost, a special glow, but only for a moment. The minute they hit a snag, their confidence goes out the window, their motivation hits rock bottom. If success means they're smart, then failure means they're dumb. That's a fixed mindset. And if you read any of Carol Dweck's work, that's exactly what she's about, trying to get kids away from a fixed mindset. Again, I would recommend at least Googling her and having a look at some of the kind of key ideas that she has. But I also think that some of these phrases, some of these ideas, ought to be out there in the teaching community far more. And actually, for some of them, they ought to be out there on classroom walls as well. Because I think it does bright kids a lot of good to see that we're thinking about this and talking about this. Some of you may have read a book by Daniel Coyle called The Talent Code. Bless you. What they're looking at is kind of mastering skills and DIY efforts. The motivation comes from belief that almost anything can be mastered if you're willing to put in the hours to master it. Mastery is an interesting concept. You don't see it very often being talked about in schools. The problem, I think, is that inherently sexist language, mastery, and you can't say mistressy, it just sounds completely different, you know. But there is an element of, I mean, it's expertise. It's about expertise in development. And I think that's the way we should be looking at our kids. And this is a quote from a parent. These top-level coaches would tell me that Michaela was just ripping up a race course. And I would say, yeah, I agree, but she's just 9 years old. They'd say, what are your plans for her? And I'd answer, plans? Well, tomorrow she's trying out for a part as the angel in the Christmas play. It's trying to get the balance right between what a kid can do in terms of their talent and a continuing normality in their lives as well. And that's a tough one. I think it's more explicit and more overt with talents in terms of PE. The kind of footballers, the tennis players, the swimmers, and frankly their lives can get pretty ripped out of shape if coaches get their hands on them too fast. And I think that causes much long-term damage. I've seen some really tragic examples of that in some of the kids that I've worked with. So it's a balancing trick. This one is Gladwell. Again, highly recommend it, just because it's an interesting book, full stop. It's from a book called Outliers. He's done two really quite interesting ones. One was called Outliers and one was called The Tipping Point. Some of it's about education, quite a lot of it isn't, but well worth a read. It's the kind of book you can take away and genuinely read anywhere you're going on holiday. It doesn't make you feel like you're working. For almost a generation, psychologists around the world have been engaged in a spirited debate over a question that most of us would consider to have been settled years ago. Is there such a thing as innate talent? The obvious answer is yes. Not every hockey player born in January ends up playing at the professional level. Only some do, the innately talented ones. Achievement is talent plus preparation. The problem with this view is that the closer psychologists look at the careers of the gifted, the smaller the role innate talent seems to play, the bigger role preparation seems to play. Again, a useful message to get out to kids. See some of you looking at why the hell January and hockey players. It was because the initial kickoff point for his experiment was that he looked at all of the hockey players playing in the Canadian League and noticed that over 90% of them were born in January. And he thought, what's going on there then? and we all know it. It's all about you spot potential early. When you spot potential early, you then start to coach it. The minute you start to coach it, the talent believes in itself and gets better. It gets better because it's got more coaching than anyone else. And the reason it was January was because their school years started in January, so their kids in January were often a year older than other kids allegedly in the same year. For hockey playing, what matters was size and balance and agility. Three things that if you're a year older at the age of 5 matters a huge amount. So it's just that. This is a guy called Paul Tough. Practice isn't the thing you do once you're good, it's the thing you do that makes you good. What matters most in a child's development, research says, is not how much information we can stuff into their brain in the first few years. What matters instead is whether we are able to help her develop a very different set of qualities. A list that includes persistence, self-control, curiosity, conscientiousness, grit, and self-confidence. Again, a useful reminder to us that there's a whole load of research coming out at the moment. Paul Tough probably kicked it off, but there's quite a lot more coming out now, looking at the issues around character and quality of character and how that supports your learning. In 10 minutes, we're going to get through this whole thing. Can you look inside your sheets? You've got this thing around intellectual curiosity. Looks like that. And the perceptive ones amongst you will have noticed that I like talking about things in tens, and there's only 9 of these. And the reason was that I couldn't come up with a 10th. So I would be hugely delighted if anyone can come up with another one to add in here, because otherwise I'm feeling incomplete. The issues around intellectual curiosity. They're all up here. That's just in more detail. What we're talking about here is how do we encourage kids? And I think, again, it's getting back to your idea of resilience. How do we encourage confusion endurance? We've all been in classrooms where the first thing a kid does when you hand out any sheets, sometimes before they even look at it, saying, I don't know what to do. What am I meant to do? And there's a whole variety of anxieties that sit behind that question. There's also a whole load of laziness that sits behind that question if we're really blatantly obvious. Sometimes without having looked at it, well, the first thing you might do is look at it. Give yourselves 5 minutes to try and work out what you want to do. But it's hugely symptomatic of a certain kind of classroom. And that classroom is the one where the teachers, effectively, the phrase I normally use is ambulatory Google. Your job is fundamentally to be what Google is when they're at home. So the minute they don't know something, they want you. And that ends up with you being hugely stressed and them pretty much having quite an easy life of things. So you need to change that balance around. Guy Claxton always talks about the 3 before me scenario. No, you don't ask me. You go to 3 alternative sources before you come to me. And that 3 before me idea is quite a nice one to get in there. You know what? You need to be thinking about asking your friend next to you. If there's something you don't get, ask them first. If you've got access online in the classroom, get onto that. You are the last resort, not the first resort. And I think that's key. And that way, and again, I think it gets back to your central question, if we're always there for them, we are doing them no favours whatsoever. Because they go on to university, the first thing you can guarantee is that that is not the way it goes. If you're in a lecture hall with 2,000 kids, 2,000 students, you are not going to be putting up your hand and saying, what am I meant to do now? Or if you are, you're going to last a few weeks, maybe. So we're not planning the future for these kids, and I think that's kind of quite scary. But I think the key element here is around actually introducing anomaly, introducing complexity, making things deliberately defamiliarized. So they have to deal with it. And I would say, as a teacher, make that extremely explicit. Make it very clear that that's what you're doing. Say to your kids, you know what, this is hard. This is really hard. You are going to find this massively challenging. I sat with a group of year 6 teachers a few weeks ago from around Wandsworth. And I quite deliberately gave them quite a tricky poem, and it was Ted Hughes, Pike. Now, if anyone knows that poem, you do have to read it a few times before you kind of get what the hell he's going on about, you know. But what was fascinating was I'm watching these teachers, and they were doing exactly what their kids do, which was their virtual hands were going up in the air. Immediately they read it. And I just said, okay, read it a couple of times. Try and locate some phrases that you do get. Try and think about what those phrases might mean. i.e., try and work out some of this stuff for yourself before you immediately go to someone that you perceive as an expert on this stuff to tell it to you. Because the one thing, I also gave them another one called Tractor. Tractor is just the most wonderful poem by R.S. Thomas. And I said, how would you go about teaching this? And their response was, oh, we take our kids down to a farm. So this is in Wandsworth. We take our kids down to a farm so they could see what a tractor was. And so they would understand what the farm environment was. And I pointed out to them that this was a poem that was set, along with Pike, in a level 6 paper. So your kids are going to have to be dealing with this on the day. It isn't going to be, I know, let's go down and see, a tractor. It's what strategies are you giving your kids to look at a poem when they really don't understand what the hell they're meant to be doing with it? What strategy are you doing to say, you know what, you can break this down, you can make this simpler, you can get through to the bits that you can get through to, and start piecing it together from them. Same scenario, if we don't introduce our kids into that so that they can start to look at that, then the minute they are confronted with something as tricky as Pike, they are going to fall apart. They're going to smash to smithereens because they've never had to deal with it themselves on their own. So I would absolutely set up lessons where you are doing it so it's as hard as you can make it. Let them know it's as hard as you can make it. Let them know they won't get it right. Let them know that it took you 15 goes at getting this thing yourself. But put them on that journey themselves. Because otherwise we're doing them no favour. And don't put them on that journey in year 6 if you're in primary. In the same way with secondary, don't suddenly start introducing the idea of an A star in year 11. These are the things that need to be worked up to. You need to be starting level 6 work in year 3. You need to be starting A star work in year 8. So they get the idea of what skills and what behaviours they need to have way earlier. Then it becomes part of what they do. If you introduce it at the last minute, it suddenly becomes this massive additionality. And that induces panic, not just in the kid, but also in the teacher. Variety of narratives. How do we organise and integrate new content into a narrative structure? What's the currently successful story? What I mean by this is very simply, every subject has got its own story. If you're a science teacher, every single frame within science has got its own story. I saw a wonderful lesson where someone was explaining to me and a whole group of 7-year-olds I'll be fair on myself, 11-year-olds, what quantum theory was. Because quantum theory is always one of the things that anyone mentions it to me, I kind of nod wisely and just panic that they're going to ask me something about it. And this teacher took it through in one lesson from the origins of particle theory, why we needed particle theory in the first place, which was news to me, to how it's changed over the last 2 centuries. And every time there is a new discovery, something new happens. And they need to rearrange their theory because it no longer fits. And it was in one lesson I got taken from the origins of particle theory to quantum physics. And I understood it. Because someone bothered to give me the narrative. Someone bothered to give me the backstory to it. And I suddenly thought, oh, I get that. I get why it fits in. I get why we're even thinking about it. Most of my education, I still believe I'm really good at Trivial Pursuit. That's pretty much it. That's what my education was for. It was a whole variety of completely unrelated facts that I can come up with like that. But actually, whether I can piece any of this stuff together, not so much. And again, I think this idea of what was the story? What did early experts think? How did they develop that? Why are we bothering with this? For bright kids, I think it's essential that they know why they're engaging with something. What does it mean? Why do we need to do this? In maths, what's the point of it? I remember, and I am this old, using a slide rule and working out cosines. I was stunningly good at it. I have not got a clue what a cosine is, why I would need to do it, because all they told me was the technique of doing it. And I was quite a quick learner. I learned how to do it, and I could do sines, cosines, tangents, all kinds of stuff on a slide rule. Means absolutely nothing to me. Now, it's that kind of thing where you get a kind of gobbet of information coming in from over here. You're told a little bit about that, and then there's nothing to piece it together with or use. Creating of an interesting hook. What I mean by this is what kind of metaphors, what imagery, what personification can we use to depict our content? A good way in to anything is a what-if question, because it engages with the student's imagination, it engages with their curiosity. They want to get involved in it because someone's saying, well, what if this? And it's a way of making sure that everyone can think about alternatives. You're not being moved in one direction, you're being moved into potentially 3 or 4 different directions. For a bright kid, it's getting them both emotionally and intellectually engaged with something. Real world problems. What is it that experts do in this field? What is it an expert historian does? What do they think about? What are the ways they think about something? Same for an expert scientist. What are the ways they do it? Look at your kids as experts in development. That's a good way of framing yourself and themselves. Presenting ideas as live, so in stressing inquiry, sense of possibility, genuine curiosity yourself. Again, it keeps coming back to you as a teacher, making sure that you demonstrate to them the kind of curiosity that you still have. Big ideas and concepts. That's what the kids really want to know about. They want to know, where is this? Where does it fit in? What's the idea behind it? Again, we automatically assume that kids understand what our subject is about. It also is quite significant that you show them, you let them see it. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because this. Give them an insight into why you still find it interesting. What is it about your subject that you wanted to do? Why did you find that involving? Why did you find that quite exciting? Another 3 minutes, okay? And then you come in. Take stabilizers off. That stands for itself. We've talked about it already, but basically we are spending too much time giving information to kids in bite-sized bits. And the danger then is that if they're being spoon-fed everything, they never get to chew anything for themselves. And getting back to your question again, I suspect that's also part of why they don't develop resilience, because it's all too scaffolded. We're designing everything so they don't fail. And then sharing what makes you excited. I think that's key. You know, where did your learning come from? What made you involved or excited about this? For me, it was a poem that I first read when I was about 12 years old by Yeats. And it was called An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. And it was one of those gobsmacking moments because I read it once, twice, 3 times, didn't understand it at all. But I knew that my entire body was kind of telling me this was wonderful. You know, the language hit me, the meaning not so much. I couldn't relate to an Irish airman contemplating life or death, because how could it mean anything to a 12-year-old kid? But actually it was hugely significant for me because it suddenly made me think words have an impact even if you don't quite get them, and you can try and work something out. And so what intrigued me was what I didn't know about something. That was the element. So I'm going to pause it there, and I hope what we've gone through has been useful so far.